One of the things that we'll look at as we get into the materials is the concept of learner engagement. Some of you mentioned that in the brainstorming activity, and the learning cycle. Now, the learning cycle, there's different versions of this out in the world in terms of instructional design and teaching and things like that. But essentially, this is the version that we use. And the idea of the learning cycle is that for every learning plan or every lesson, we've defined the competency up front. That's our end in mind. That's where we want to end up. And so as we take students through a series of activities, our goal is to follow this learning cycle, because this is based on how people learn best. So we start with the motivation activities, something to engage the students and to get them interested in what we're going to be talking about, to connect it to previous learning. There's a lot of aspects to that motivation activity. The second step in the cycle is comprehension. This is where they get the information. They do need information. This is where they view a slide presentation or read an information sheet to get the information that they need to start to absorb and understand. The third phase is called the practice phase. And this is where they start to do something with that information that they're learning, right? So that's that idea of taking what they're learning, do something with it, discuss it, think about it, do some kind of a practice activity, reinforces their learning. Typically in a learning, what you'll see in a learning plan is typically you go back and forth between these two phases a couple of times so that you're giving them smaller chunks and reinforcing smaller chunks, comprehension, practice, and then ultimately the application. So by using the learning cycle, what you're doing is you're avoiding cognitive overload, really, because you're trying to chunk the amount of information and content into smaller pieces and then reinforcing it with some type of a practice activity. So you'll see that pattern as we get into the curriculum. The final step is the application, where they apply to demonstrate mastery. So again, this is what they're doing at the end to kind of pull it all together and hopefully walk out the door with a useful, we call them artifacts in education, that they walk out the door with that hopefully will be helpful to them as they are working on their land access. So the trainer's role in all this is at the motivation stage to inspire, at the comprehension phase to inform, either through a presentation or some other kinds of sources of the actual information and content. During the practice phases, it's to coach them through those, to give them feedback on their performance so they can start to head towards that model of how they'll want to do it. If they're doing a land assessment or something like that, they can get better and better at it. And then at the application phase, it's kind of mentoring them through that process. The student learning plan, I've mentioned that a couple of times. If you think about learner engagement, that's one of the roles that the student learning plan can play. It provides a roadmap for student learning. It helps to shift the responsibility a little bit onto the student because they have information. What are they going to be doing next? So that they can be prepared as you shift from activity to activity. It can be used to create a workshop agenda or brochure, so participants know what they're going to be doing in a particular training session. The idea here is that with the materials that you'll see are available to you, is that potentially you could create a packet of materials for your participants. And that would include the student learning plan, the information sheets that are available, and the activity sheets. So as people come into your training sessions, they could have those materials. Now, for some people, that's a challenge, copying and, making copies of things. But in some way, if you can make those things available to the learners, it'll be useful to them. This is a little bit closer up of a view. I hope you can see it okay, of how the learning activities in the learning plans follow the learning cycle. So these are the activities that for a particular one of the lessons, I think it's for is it the fifth one, I guess is what this says here. So you can see motivation, comprehension, practice, and then you would see a couple more rounds of that. We made the decision early on to include these terms in the student learning plan. It's really a design thinking thing, but it's also helpful to the learners to start to learn what that means. And as a trainer, if you can even tell them, explain it to them, this is why we do this, because it helps you learn, then you're helping them become better learners. So we made a decision early on to include that information in the student learning plan because it's a very useful concept for students or for the learners as well, to start to get that idea of comprehension, practice, apply. Teaching plans, we'll be looking at these in more detail later as well. You'll be able to access the actual teaching plans. This is where we build on that student learning plan, add recommended teaching notes, give you an estimate of how much time we think things are going to take, and also point you to the materials that support each of these activities. The idea with the teaching plan is that this is the plan, but you're welcome to deviate from the plan. You might want to do things a little bit differently. You may not have as much time. You may need to cut some things out. You may need to adapt, et cetera, et cetera. We'll be looking at and talking about how to approach that. And then the final part is the materials that support learning and assessment. This is an example of an information sheet. It's a comparison chart in one of the lessons. So you'll see that each lesson has a sets of materials to support these activities. At the assessment level or the application level, what we tried to come up with is activities that were that address the competency and that were good takeaway documents or activities for the participants. So they would really walk out the door with something useful. So for example, this is a land acquisition action plan. It says LP6 and LP7 because it's pretty much the same action plan for either renting or purchasing, but they would approach it from different aspects. So they would actually walk out the door with an action plan or some type of tool that will be useful to them. So in thinking through that idea of assessment or application, what we wanted to do was prepare learners for key land access events. So if you think about, this is just one example. There's an aspect of the curriculum that focuses on financial assessments and stuff, okay? So the idea of the assessment is to do a financial self-assessment. The artifact that they walk out with is a financial planning worksheet, okay? So that's the tool that they use to do that financial assessment, and they actually have that worksheet that they can take with them. And then that prepares them for financing a land acquisition. So it's a real event that we're preparing them for. Another competency, assess suitability of land for farming and ranching. The assessment is a land assessment simulation, hopefully, either on site somewhere or in some other way. The artifact is a land assessment checklist, again, a useful tool that they can use to perform the assessment or the simulation, but also can walk out the door with, and it prepares them to actually assess a land parcel in real life, okay? So we're trying to make that connection to real life. The last part is the materials and resources for the trainers. You'll see there's a lot there for you. There is the teaching plan. There are resource lists like this for every lesson. So if you're in an area that you're a little less familiar with, there's many resources that you can access to learn more about it, to think about what you might want to incorporate for your participants. So you'll find there's a lot of useful things for you. So the key land access training documents, which we'll be looking at a little more closely in a little bit, is the student learning plan, which we've discussed, the student learning and assessment materials, including information sheets, activities, etc. The teaching plan, which is for you and helps you begin that process of training, and then all of those resources that you can access to support your efforts of training. The next thing that we're going to do is a brainstorming activity. And so the way that this works, we're going to use a tool called Padlet, which is a virtual sort of a brainstorming thing. You can get a free version of it if you want to try it. It's kind of fun. What I want you to brainstorm is the characteristics of an effective trainer. So if you can think about a time where either you were participating in a training or you were the trainer and things really went well, what are some of the things that make someone an effective trainer? So I want you to do some brainstorming on that. See if it looks like you figured it out. You add your little Post-its. It's hard to be approachable and personable if you're like frantically trying to deal with a mess because you're not well prepared, or something changes and you have to deal with it at the last minute. So our goal is to help you use some tools to be as prepared as you can be. Have the background on the topic, even if it's not something that you're the most comfortable with. So that we'll kind of get to that a little bit later in the session.